Have you ever wondered how many secrets fit within a simple equation? You might think math is for school, but what if I told you a scientist managed to hide clues to his own disappearance within seemingly indecipherable formulas? Yes, it sounds crazy, but that's exactly the investigation I, John Spencer, am about to share with you. Before continuing, are you subscribed to the channel yet? If not, take this opportunity to subscribe, like, and comment, because that way you'll help me bring you even more mysterious stories like this. What fascinates me most about this case is the paradox. The more you tried to understand the equations, the less sense they made, and at the same time the more nonsensical they seemed, the more clues began to emerge. Have you ever experienced something like this? When you try to solve a problem and suddenly discover that the answer was never where you were looking for it, but hidden between the lines, hidden in plain sight. It's disconcerting, and that's precisely the feeling you'll have as you delve into this story with me. Another controversial point: why would someone disappear on purpose, leaving behind enigmas that only a few could solve? Wouldn't it be easier to simply disappear? That's the first belief I want to dispel with you. Because Kellerman's disappearance wasn't cowardice, it was strategy. He didn't run away, he constructed a mental labyrinth to choose who would be worthy of reaching him. That changes everything, don't you think? And that's where the quick reward comes in. With every detail I reveal, you'll realize this isn't just an investigation, but a psychological game where logic, courage, and resilience become the true weapon. And believe me, at the end of this journey, you'll see life's problems in ways you may never have before. Now stay with me, because the case of the missing formula is just beginning. I received that dossier on a rainy afternoon, when the tinkling of drops on the window seemed synchronized with the weight of my thought. The manila envelope, sealed almost ceremonially, held a promise. It wasn't just another case. It was the kind of enigma that made my mind boil like freshly brewed coffee. Since becoming an investigator, I've learned that the silence of a sealed envelope can be more deafening than 1,000 voices. And in that moment, I knew something big was about to happen. Inside were only 3 items: a faded photo of a serious-looking man, a few loose pages with calculations that looked like something out of a mathematical nightmare, and an unsigned note: "Find me before they do." That was the sentence that stared at me like an accusation. I've investigated cases of counterfeiters, thieves, and even politicians with dirty secrets, but I confess I'd never seen numbers scream as loudly as those equations. When I closed my eyes for a moment, I heard the echo of my own voice reminding me of the hundreds of times a seemingly insignificant detail became the key to a mystery. People often believe investigations are about physical evidence, but I've learned that it's the enigmas hidden between the lines that truly tell the story. And those pages, well, they weren't just begging to be read, they were defying logic. I held the file tightly, and felt a chill as if the case had chosen me, not the other way around. Maybe it was coincidence, maybe fate, but deep down I knew this disappearance wasn't just about a missing scientist. It was about something bigger, something that could redraw the boundaries between the possible and the impossible. And it was precisely at that point that I realized my life was about to intertwine with a sequence of clues that would lead to places few would dare explore. His name was Arthur Kellerman, one of those men whose presence in any room made others shrink without him saying a word. Not because of his physical appearance, but because of the aura of genius he carried. Known in academic circles as a visionary, he moved between quantum physics, cryptography, and even theories about renewable energy. Many called him crazy, others a genius, but everyone without exception recognized that his mind was years ahead of its time. For years, Kellerman racked up achievements that defied conventional wisdom. His most famous work involved equations capable of predicting patterns in seemingly chaotic systems, from weather patterns to fluctuations in financial markets. These weren't just formulas, they were maps to the unknown. For some, this meant progress. For others, danger. After all, imagine the power of controlling variables that no one else could understand. I remember an international conference where I had the chance to observe him up close. He didn't use slides or colorful graphs. He simply scribbled enigmatic symbols on a blackboard. While many frowned, I realized it wasn't a show for the audience, but a direct conversation with the very logic of the universe. And this detail always intrigued me. It seemed he wasn't explaining anything to anyone, merely recording what was already written in some invisible corner of reality. Now, with his disappearance, those same achievements became pieces of a dark puzzle. Where there had once been prestige, doubts remained. Where there had been applause, veiled accusations emerged. It was impossible not to wonder, who would have an interest in silencing such a powerful mind? And more importantly, how far had that mind gone before disappearing into the abyss of the unknown? Kellerman's last photograph took place on a cold night, in the lobby of an old, decommissioned observatory on the outskirts of the city. Security cameras captured him entering alone, carrying a battered leather briefcase, and a look that blended haste and conviction. Curiously, no camera showed him leaving, as if he'd dissolved into thin air. Only emptiness and doubt remained. A detail I've learned throughout my career. When a trail ends so abruptly, it's because someone has erased it with surgical precision. At the observatory, I found traces that seemed more like symbols than simply forgotten objects. A still warm coffee pot, a pen dropped near the stairs, and on a table, chalk marks forming incomplete circles and arrows. It was as if he'd left a trail of breadcrumbs for someone who knew how to interpret them. Many would say they were signs of desperation. I saw a deliberate pattern, and that always changes everything. One witness swore she saw a black car parked nearby that same night, but couldn't remember its license plate. Another, more superstitious, said she heard voices coming from inside the building, voices that didn't belong solely to Arthur. In the world of investigation, reports like these can be gold or sand slipping through your fingers, and my job has always been to separate one from the other. As I walked through that dusty, silent space, I couldn't help but think of how many times I'd been in similar places, scenarios where absence speaks louder than any presence. Kellerman's last appearance wasn't just a physical disappearance. It was a coded message, a veiled invitation to anyone brave enough to decipher it, and of course I accepted. When I entered the locked observatory room, my first sensation was claustrophobia. The air was heavy, tainted with dust and stale coffee. There were no signs of a struggle, no fresh footprints, just silence. And in the center of the table, like a trophy left on purpose, was a black-covered note. I opened it slowly, feeling the creak of the aged pages. And there they were, equations that didn't seem to belong in this world. Jumbled symbols, fragmented formulas, scribbles that moved in my mind like pieces of an unfinished puzzle. I've dealt with forgeries and amateur code, but this was different. The pages conveyed a hidden logic, as if they were instructions for something not meant to be easily understood. It was almost like looking at the sheet music of a song written in a dead language. The more I read, the more I realized that the enigma lay not just in the mathematics, but in the silence between the numbers, in the spaces it left blank. That was where the true secret lay. There were also smears of smudged ink, as if he'd written in a hurry. Some calculations were interrupted midway, lines ended in nothing, arrows pointed to unanswered margins. It seemed like a brilliant mind trying to defeat time itself. That notebook wasn't just a record of theories. It was a diary of escape, a coded farewell letter, an invitation to follow in his footsteps. But only if I had the courage to play the same mental game. I closed the notebook and felt its weight in my hands. It wasn't paper and ink. It was a burden. I already knew that. From then on, each page would push me deeper into a labyrinth of logic and mystery. And in the back of my mind, a question throbbed relentlessly. How far will a man go to protect his greatest secret? Kellerman's past, I realized his research didn't just emerge from nowhere. There was a tenuous connection between his theories and minds that had shaped the history of science. Old documents showed that he obsessively studied Nikola Tesla's diaries, especially those about wireless energy and global magnetic field. It wasn't simple admiration. It was almost an attempt to continue work the world had tried to bury, and that sounded dangerous to me, because unsolved secrets always resurface with double the force. But it didn't stop there. Among the scientist's notes, I found direct references to Einstein, especially to his famous search for a unified theory. Kellerman seemed convinced that the equations he left in his notebook were the bridge between classical physics and unexplained phenomena. To some, this kind of obsession is pure madness. To me, it was a sign that he had touched on something too real to ignore. And the more I read, the more I realized that his logic wasn't isolated. It was stitched together with historical threads connecting geniuses, separated by decades. The most intriguing part, however, was his connection to Cold War documents. Confidential files indicated that Kellerman had access to secret reports on mind manipulation experiments, invisible radars, and even time travel theory. Many would call them conspiracy theories, but I've learned that the line between fact and delusion is thinner than one might think. If he truly managed to piece together these fragments, then his equations weren't just science. They were the key to rewriting reality itself. As I connected the dots, I began to sense I was facing something greater than a simple disappearance. The scientist hadn't vanished by chance. He carried on his shoulders a legacy that went far beyond his personal discovery. It was as if all the secrets the world had tried to hide over the past century had found a new guardian in him. And this raised the question, who would be willing to do anything to get their hands on this forbidden inheritance? When I returned to the notebook for the second time, I realized that those equations weren't just mathematical formulas. There was a strange cadence to them, as if they were simultaneously calculus and poetry. Lines filled with numbers suddenly broke to give way to geometric symbols, arrows that formed spirals, and ancient letters reminiscent of forgotten alphabet. It was science, yes, but with a hint of mysticism, as if Kellerman had decided to conceal his knowledge in an indecipherable mixture of logic and art. One detail caught my attention. Some pages were written in different layers of ink, as if he'd returned days later to add new elements. In certain passages, I could see patterns of classical cryptography, similar to those used in war to transmit secret messages. Only unlike ordinary codes, the decryption keys seemed to be hidden within the formulas themselves. It was like trying to open a safe whose secret changes every second. This hybrid form of writing wasn't new to me. Years ago, I investigated a group of forgers who used mathematical equations as a front to hide illegal bank accounts. But what Kellerman did went much further. It wasn't just hiding information. It was challenging any mind that tried to penetrate it, as if he were certain that only someone prepared, someone willing to lose themselves in logic, would be able to see the hidden message. The more I analyzed, the more it seemed the equations were moving before my eyes, not because they were actually changing, but because my brain was trying to force a pattern where there seemed to be none. It was like looking at clouds and seeing shape. Only here, the shapes hid secrets that could rewrite the laws of nature. And I wondered, was I ready to discover what lay behind this forbidden mathematics? In the corner of one of the pages, nearly erased by time, was a phrase scrawled in tiny handwriting. Where the sky touches the earth, the truth hides. At first glance, it seemed like cheap poetry, or the musings of a tired scientist. But I learned early on that nothing in a puzzle of this magnitude is placed by chance. I took out my magnifying glass, examined it closely, and noticed that the words formed a curious pattern, as if each letter were deliberately misplaced. It was a code hidden in the handwriting, a trick I'd seen used in espionage. I spent hours trying to decipher it until the solution suddenly appeared. Every third letter revealed a coordinate. They weren't obvious numbers, but when rearranged, they formed something approaching latitude and longitude. My eyes lit up at that moment. Kellerman had left a map hidden in plain sight. It was almost childish, yet brilliant at the same time. He knew that anyone curious would give up too quickly, and only someone obsessed with logic would continue. I followed the coordinates on an old map and realized they pointed to a forgotten part of the city, an ancient underground library, closed since the 1950s due to the risk of collapse. Curious, isn't it? A modern scientist pointing to a place buried in the past, full of secrets few would dare revisit. It was as if he were trying to lead me into a time capsule. And deep down I knew that places like these often hold more questions than answers. I took a deep breath. I've been in situations where a seemingly trivial clue has led me to reveal secrets that many would give their lives to protect. This one would be no different. The marginal note wasn't just an instruction. It was an invitation. And as always, when we accept invitations like that, there's no turning back. When I finally reached the underground library, I found what appeared to be an ordinary concrete wall, but in its center was an ancient metal panel, inlaid with gears and small dials. It wasn't an ordinary padlock. It was a riddle, engraved in bas relief. It read, "Truth is not surrendered by force, but by reason." That brought an involuntary smile to my face. I've seen criminals hide secrets in safes, but a scientist, of course he'd choose a logic puzzle as its guardian. The dashboard featured 3 numbered wheels, and a partial sequence of equations scrawled above. At first glance, they were incomplete calculations, but rearranging the symbols, I realized they hid a classic enigma, a mathematical progression interrupted in the middle. All I had to do was find the missing number to spin the wheels in the correct order. Easy? Not so much. Kellerman had inserted subtle deviations, false equations between the true ones, like traps to mislead any hurried mind. I spent long minutes deep in thought, remembering other cases where I'd had to solve riddles to access safes or secret archives. Once a criminal even left a Sudoku puzzle incomplete to mislead investigators. But Kellerman's was different. It required not just logic, but attention to detail, to what seemed insignificant. It was as if he wanted to test my patience before allowing me to continue. Finally, after calmly reviewing each line, the answer emerged as clear as morning light. I adjusted the metal wheels one by one, and the panel emitted a dry click, like the sigh of a relieved machine. The wall slid slowly away, revealing a narrow passage, lit only by ancient slivers of light. The dilemma was overcome, but deep down I knew this was just the first of many tests to come. Kellerman's records. It didn't take long to realize that his disappearance wasn't just a mystery. The man collected enemies in academia like others collect stamps. Between published articles and contested conferences, there was always someone ready to challenge his ideas, not for lack of merit, but out of pure envy. And let's face it, when someone is ahead of their time, they tend to annoy more than they inspire. I discovered that his research had been the target of sabotage attempts. A confidential report cited colleagues who tried to discredit his results, insinuating experimental fraud. Curious how the very environment that should nurture science often turns into a battleground of ego. Kellerman, instead of backing down, openly challenged everyone, exposing flaws in his critics' arguments with the coolness of a surgeon. He was brilliant and reckless, and long before accusations surfaced that he was hiding valuable information, possibly to sell to governments or corporations. Of course, there was never any concrete evidence, but in the world of investigation, I learned that the absence of evidence doesn't mean the absence of truth. These accusations gained momentum, and soon became fertile ground for conspiracy. Who would profit if his discoveries fell into the wrong hands? That was the question that haunted me like a shadow. By connecting the dots, I realized that the disappearance might not be a coincidence, but a direct consequence of this web of conflict. When science and power intersect, the lines between ethics and ambition become dangerously blurred. And perhaps Kellerman had foreseen this, which would explain why he hid his equations like dynamite in a safe. After all, knowledge in the wrong hands can be as lethal as gunpowder. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that Kellerman wasn't just dealing with academic rivals. Among the papers hidden in the library, I found folders marked with strange symbols, some bearing confidentiality seals that only appear on government agency documents. The most disturbing detail: many of these folders were incomplete, as if someone had deliberately removed crucial pages. This wasn't the work of a resentful professor. This reeked of a secret organization, with interests beyond mere intellectual vanity. One of the dossiers mentioned a group called simply Orion. I'd never heard of it officially, but longtime sources had told me similar names during industrial espionage investigations. Interestingly, this Orion seemed to have branches in both governments and private corporations. It was the kind of invisible structure that benefits precisely from never being officially recognized. And let's face it, if they were after Kellerman's formula, there was plenty of reason for concern. I remembered an operation I led years ago, involving secret documents missing from a military laboratory. At the time, I discovered that occult societies don't operate like they do in the movies, with cloaks and rituals. They disguise themselves in contracts, discreet meetings, and handshakes in quiet hallways. What I saw in Kellerman's papers gave me exactly the same feeling: an invisible power stalking his every step, waiting for the right moment to act. The conclusion was inevitable. The scientist's disappearance could no longer be treated as an isolated case. From the moment organizations of this caliber enter the game, the rules change. We're no longer just talking about logic and enigmas, but survival. And honestly, I could already feel that with each lead I followed, I was getting closer to the kind of truth many people would pay dearly to keep buried. Kellerman's notebook, determined to observe every detail with even more attentive eye. It was then that I noticed something curious. Certain equations, when lined up in sequence, formed not just numerical results, but patterns that completely escaped traditional mathematical logic. It was as if the numbers were there to disguise something else. I marked some points with a pencil, and realized that together, they drew a kind of cryptographic map. Science, suddenly, had revealed a cartographic secret. I applied an old analysis technique, the same one I'd used years ago when deciphering codes hidden in smugglers' notes. I rearranged the results,
and realized they formed something very close to a latitude and longitude. My heart raced. It wasn't theory. It was location. Kellerman didn't just leave clues. He wanted someone to arrive at a specific location, as if the disappearance itself were part of a meticulously planned itinerary. When I entered the coordinates into my map, the destination sent a chill down my spine. An isolated spot, lost among mountains and forests, miles from civilization. There were no registered roads, no tourist trails, just a void marked by topographical symbols, indicating ancient cave. It was the kind of place where secrets are hidden, not by chance, but by convenience. Places like these don't just hold mysteries, they seem designed to repel the curious. I closed the notebook and took a deep breath. I knew that following those coordinates would mean crossing an invisible boundary, from a simple missing person case to something much larger, perhaps even more dangerous. But at the same time, not following them would mean denying the essence of my life as an investigator. Deep down, I already knew it wasn't me choosing the journey. It was the hidden message itself that pulled me like a magnet toward its next enigma. The journey to the coordinates was anything but simple. Paved roads soon turned into dirt trails, and the trails into paths that existed only in the memory of the trees. With every kilometer, I felt like I was moving away from the civilized world and entering a territory time had forgotten. My old Jeep complained on the steep climbs, but it seemed to understand, as I did, that there was no turning back. When you accept a trail like this, it's like walking through a door that closes behind you. As I moved forward, I noticed the almost disturbing absence of life. There were no birds, nor the insistent buzzing of insects, only the sound of the wind, rustling branches, and the roar of the engine. This forced stillness always unsettles me, because in my job, I've learned that silence is rarely natural. It's the kind of detail that betrays that something or someone has purposefully shaped the environment. And in this case, it seemed as if the forest itself held a secret, keeping me alert at every turn. When I finally reached the exact coordinates, I came face to face with the entrance to a cave camouflaged by rocks and moss. If it weren't for the map hidden in the equations, I would never have noticed. It was as if the place had been erased from human view. I took out my flashlight, and before entering, I couldn't help but smile. How many times have I stood before doors like this, knowing that behind them lay not only answers, but calculated risks to keep out the curious.
With each step into the cave, the echo of my movements seemed to amplify the feeling of being watched. Damp walls reflected the light in strange patterns, almost like natural symbols. It was impossible not to wonder, had Kellerman really been here, or had he merely led me into a theater of illusions? I was about to find out, and something told me that what awaited me inside would change the course of this investigation. Inside, I found something that chilled my blood. Among damp stones and ancient marks was a small makeshift table, littered with scraps of notes and recent food packaging. It wasn't a hiding place abandoned decades ago as I'd imagined, but rather a shelter recently used. And most disturbing of all, on the scribbled pages, I recognized Kellerman's handwriting. He'd been there, or perhaps he was still nearby. For the first time, I seriously considered the possibility that the disappearance hadn't been a kidnapping but a planned staging. The more I looked, the more evidence emerged. A spent candle still smelling of melted wax, a half-empty water bottle, and even a fragmented diary of sorts. In its pages, Kellerman wrote of invisible stalkers, but also spoke of needing to disappear so that the truth may survive. That phrase hammered into my mind like a bullet. Perhaps he hadn't been a victim, but rather the architect of his own disappearance, and that, for me, completely changed the rules of the game. I remembered other cases I'd investigated, where criminals faked their own deaths to escape justice, where victims staged their own kidnappings to attract attention. But there was no cheap vanity here. There was strategy. Kellerman seemed to have created a smokescreen, not just to protect himself, but to protect something greater, his lost formula. And with each clue, I began to feel like I wasn't just chasing a man, but the calculated reasoning of a master riddler. The idea was disturbing. If he disappeared of his own volition, then every coordinate, every note, every clue left behind was part of a puzzle he'd set up himself. I wasn't just the investigator. I was the pawn he'd chosen to advance his plot. And I confess, Nothing scares an investigator more than realizing that instead of leading the investigation, he's being led by it. Inside the cave, I found a metal box covered in dust and rust, but locked with an ingenuity that left no doubt. This was no accident. Engraved on the lid was the phrase, "The mind is the only key." When I opened it, I realized there was no gold, no weapons, no documents. There were only sheets of logic puzzles, riddles that seemed straight out of a mental training manual. It was clear, Kellerman didn't want to be found by just anyone. He had prepared tests to filter the curious from the true seekers. The first riddle seemed simple. 3 doors, 3 guardians, and only one safe path. I remembered seeing this classic in books, but the difference lay in the details of the instructions, carefully altered so that only an attentive person would notice the inconsistency. I spent long minutes reasoning, almost hearing the scientist's voice teasing me. "Are you really paying attention, John?" I solved the riddle, and behind the sheet of paper was another, more complex one, like levels in a game designed to test not only intelligence but also resilience. Each puzzle seemed to carry an implicit lesson. A number test required patience, a symbolic riddle, intuition, a logic puzzle, the ability to think outside the box. It was as if Kellerman was evaluating me, piece by piece, not just to gauge my reasoning, but my character as an investigator. And this resonated with me, because in all my years of career, I had never felt so directly challenged, not by criminals, but by someone who seemed to know me without us ever having met. In the end, I realized I wasn't just solving riddles. I was going through a kind of rite of passage, a mental and psychological filter that said, if you've made it this far, you deserve to move forward. And as I pocketed the last few pages, I realized the game was just beginning. Each step brought me closer, not only to Kellerman's whereabouts, but to the mind behind him. And believe me, facing a mind like that can be more dangerous than facing any weapon. It was at the cave's exit that I realized I wasn't alone. There was no obvious noise, but a seasoned investigator's nose recognizes when the air changes. The sound of snapping branches, too subtle to be casual, betrayed calculated footsteps. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this invisible weight on my back. Throughout my career, I've learned that the shadow of danger never warns, only insinuates itself. And that night, it walked with me. I glanced around discreetly and noticed fresh tire tracks on the trail I'd left hours ago. This bothered me because there was no accessible road in that area, which meant someone had found another route, someone prepared. The mere fact that I hadn't seen anything beforehand was enough to show the level of the adversary. This wasn't a curious person, nor an amateur. This was someone trained, someone who knew how to hide, and most alarmingly, someone with the same goal as me. As I advanced, I began to spot even clearer signs. A freshly stubbed cigarette butt, footprints overlapping mine, and even the distant reflection of a lens. When the moonlight hit at just the right angle, it was as if the pursuer wanted to let me know he was there, testing my limit. It wasn't just a chase, it was a mind game, and I knew how to play it. I took a deep breath, keeping my pace steady, as if nothing had happened. But inside, every muscle was on alert. This feeling brought back memories of other investigations, where danger lurked in the darkness, ready to spring when I least expected it. Only now there was a crucial difference. It wasn't just my life at stake, but also the key to deciphering the lost formula. And if anyone was willing to follow my footsteps this far, I could bet they wouldn't give up easily. Deep down, I was certain. The game was no longer just between me and Kellerman. Now there was a third player at the table. Kellerman's scribbles. There were constant mentions of something called Project Helios. At first, I thought it was just a code name for his research. But cross-referencing information with old Cold War documents, I discovered that Helios was actually a secret program with global. The promise? A formula capable of manipulating energy patterns, and even influencing human behavior on a collective scale. It wasn't pure science. It was power condensed into symbols. Kellerman's disappearance was not the result of a random abduction, but part of a carefully crafted conspiracy. He was at the center of a chessboard, where governments, corporations, and secret organizations were vying for something that could change the course of the world. If Project Helios were real, whoever controlled it would have in their hands a weapon more lethal than any bomb, the power to shape realities and consciousnesses. I remembered previous cases where theories seemed delusional until secret documents proved otherwise. Mind manipulation experiments, research into invisible weapons, resonance tests, capable of altering mass emotions. All of this seemed like fiction, until I saw the evidence before my eyes. What Kellerman possessed went beyond all that. He had not only cracked the code, but created the key, and perhaps that was precisely why he had decided to disappear. This revelation changed everything. I was no longer investigating just a lost scientist, but a secret that could reshape the boundaries of humanity. And if Project Helios was truly active, I needed to discover not only where Kellerman was, but also who had already gotten their hands on his formula. The game of riddles and chases had just turned into a race against time. I reached a hidden room deep within the cave, lit by natural crevices that let the light in almost sacred beams. In the center was a stone pedestal, and on it, another notebook, smaller and cleaner than the last. But this time, along with the pages, there was a curious mechanism, 3 interconnected metal discs that rotated like clockwork gears. Engraved on the base was an inscription: "Truth reveals itself only to those who keep a cool mind." I knew, in that instant, that I was faced with the ultimate enigma. The notebook's pages explained the rules enigmatically. You had to align the discs according to a logical pattern hidden in the written numbers. Each wrong turn triggered a locking mechanism that destroyed part of the notes. It was a game of precision, and I had only one real chance. Sweat beaded on my forehead, not from the heat, but from the knowledge that any mistake would mean losing the key. Kellerman had worked so hard to protect. As I analyzed it, I realized it wasn't just a mathematical calculation. It was a combination of logic and intuition, a challenge that tested both my skill with numbers and my ability to perceive subtle patterns. I remembered a time when I had to solve a code in the middle of a police chase, with no time to think, just relying on accumulated experience. This puzzle had the same flavor. More than solving it, I needed to feel the solution. I turned the discs slowly, aligning symbols that at first glance seemed random. Gradually, the pattern revealed itself. A hidden Fibonacci sequence, interspersed with ancient characters that only made sense in the right context. The moment the last disc clicked into place, the mechanism emitted a dull click and gently opened, revealing a secret drawer. Inside, carefully tucked away, was a cloth-wrapped flash drive, perhaps the digital key to the entire lost formula. Inside the secret drawer, next to the flash drive, was a recent photograph. Kellerman, unshaven and weary-looking, sitting at a desk strewn with papers. The photo was dated and time-stamped, taken just 2 weeks earlier. This confirmed what I already suspected. He was alive. And more than that, he was closely following every step of the game he had created. The disappearance was no longer a mystery, and became a calculated plan to lead anyone worthy to the scene. In the photo behind him, I noticed details that only a trained investigator would notice. A window with rough curtains, a makeshift bookshelf, and the reflection of a snow-capped mountain. It wasn't the cave. It was another location, hidden even deeper in the territory I was just beginning to explore. Kellerman hadn't just disappeared. He'd moved to a new hiding place, leaving clues for whoever had solved the final puzzle. Among the papers, I found a handwritten letter. "John Spencer," it began, as if already knowing I would be the one chosen to find his marks. "If you've come this far, it's because you understand that the real danger isn't the formula itself, but those who seek to control it. I didn't run away. I hid to protect something greater than myself. And if you decide to continue, you'll face not only enigmas, but people capable of anything." It was a warning, almost a confession. I closed my eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of that mess. Finding proof of Kellerman's whereabouts wasn't the end of the investigation, but the beginning of a much larger dilemma. Now I knew he was alive. I knew he was guiding me. And I knew the conspiracy surrounding him wouldn't rest until they got their hands on the formula. The discovery was just another open door, and I was about to walk through it. Kellerman's letter that I understood the true game. The lost formula wasn't just a sequence of complex mathematical equations. It was above all a filter. He didn't want just anyone to have access to it, but only someone capable of demonstrating not only logical reasoning but also resilience and ethics. With each puzzle I solved,
I realized that the scientist wasn't just testing my mind. He was weighing my character, like someone evaluating whether or not to hand over a key. The flash drive I found contained encrypted files. The instructions were clear. They could only be opened with a password formed from the sum of all the puzzles solved. Up to that point. In other words, the knowledge wasn't simply locked away, but depended on the entire journey. Kellerman's science, therefore, was inseparable from the logic of his tests. It was as if he had created not just a formula, but an intellectual labyrinth that would only be open to those truly worthy. The most surprising part, however, was discovering that part of the formula didn't have direct application to machines or weapons, but rather to people. These calculations revealed patterns of behavior, almost like a predictive science of the human mind. Kellerman seemed to believe that with the right numbers, it was possible to anticipate decisions, predict choices, and even guide entire societies. This was brilliant and terrifying. In the wrong hands, it could mean manipulation on a global scale. Suddenly, I realized I wasn't just deciphering a scientist's legacy. I was being put to the test to decide whether that legacy should be revealed or destroyed. The true missing formula was trust. Trust that someone faced with the temptation of absolute power had the wisdom not to be corrupted. And in that instant I realized that perhaps the investigation wasn't about finding Kellerman, but about discovering who I would become along the way. As I tucked the flash drive into my coat pocket, I felt that old weight on my chest that only appears when the truth is too close, yet still just out of reach. I had deciphered riddles, followed clues, faced unseen persecution, and finally understood part of Kellerman's mind. But still something nagged at me. It was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle, and realizing that despite the image I'd formed, there was still a missing piece, a piece that could change everything. Back above ground, the cold mountain wind seemed to carry whispers that had haunted me since the beginning of this investigation. I turned the letter over once more and noticed something I had previously overlooked. An incomplete signature. Just with a line that extended as if deliberately broken. It was too small a detail to overlook. It was a symbol, perhaps a reminder that the real game wasn't over yet. Staring at the horizon, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. My instincts rarely fail. Maybe it was my pursuer still lurking. Maybe it was Kellerman himself, gauging from afar whether I truly deserved to reach him. Either way, it was clear that I wasn't the only player on this board, and that meant the next move wasn't up to me alone. Deep down, I understood that the flash drive and all those clues weren't the end, but merely the opening of an even bigger chapter. There was a layered conspiracy, secrets that remained buried, waiting for whoever was brave enough to dig deep. And I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this case wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. Now tell me, after everything you've heard, do you think you'd have the courage to follow through with a puzzle like that? Because it's not just about solving formulas or deciphering symbols. It's about facing your own fear, testing your patience, and discovering how far your mind can go when truly challenged. And between you and me, how many times in your life have you given up on something just because it seemed too complicated? Kellerman case shows that every obstacle can hide a clue, and every enigma is in fact an opportunity to prove that you're capable of going further. But the question is, do you face it or retreat? Because believe me, the way you respond to daily challenges defines not only your victories, but also the secrets you'll never discover if you don't have the courage to persist. I want you to reflect. What is the lost formula in your life? That thing that seems impossible, but perhaps is just waiting for patience, logic, and resilience on your part. Isn't it time to stop running away and start deciphering? Think about it and answer me in the comments. I want to know how far you'd be willing to go in an investigation like that. And of course, if this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave a like, because I still have many investigations and mysteries to share. And believe me, each one can change the way you see the world. This was just one piece of the puzzle, and I guarantee the next ones will be even more challenging.